changed. Well, a series of incidents in the US is raising questions about a lack of civility in politics that seems to be spilling out into everyday life.
Shame! 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 Shame!
Recent public confrontations include protesters yelling shame at Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen at a Mexican restaurant in Washington over the administration's immigration crackdown. Also, Pam Bondi, the Florida Attorney General, confronted by protesters at a movie screening over her support of President Trump's policies.
Stephen Miller, a controversial senior advisor to the president and an architect of his immigration policy, was heckled and called a fascist at a D.C. restaurant. And, of course, Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, being asked to leave a restaurant in Virginia because she worked for the Trump administration. Following the Sanders incident, Congresswoman Maxine Waters urged her supporters to keep it up.
And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
So, can we expect more of this? Is it justified? Should we get back to a place of greater civility? And if so, how? Evan Siegfried joins us now from New York. He is a Republican strategist and commentator and author of the upcoming book, The Descent of Decency. So it's actually a pretty good time to be talking to you, Evan, this book of yours. You're part of what you're looking at, as I read it, is the tone of discourse today and how we got here. How did we get here?
Well, it's been a very gradual move over 6+ decades. I actually believe the first point where we started to move on this path to today was in the 1950s with the House Un-American Activities Committee, with Joseph McCarthy labeling everybody he didn't like a communist and saying that there were communists infesting the State Department and doing real scare tactics. And then we sort of moved away. Edward R. Murrow bravely stood up and called McCarthy a liar, and it helped to destroy McCarthy's career. But then in the 60s, we saw something terrible happen. From 1964, which was when the public had the highest level of trust in the federal government in the United States, at 77% of all Americans, to 1974, we saw several events which completely eroded the public's trust in government. And those were the Vietnam War, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, and then the 1968 Democratic National Convention and the chaos there. Then we had the Pentagon Papers, and then Richard Nixon and Watergate. Those events caused an entire generation of Americans to lose all trust in government, and we can see it reflected in the polling at the time of public trust. And that shaped that generation of Americans to be naturally distrustful of their leaders, to think that they aren't going to be going out and doing the right thing. And we saw a more and more gradual move toward a more uncivil tone. And the moment when things actually changed for the worse, and the sea change moment, was the 1986 nomination of Robert Bork to sit on the Supreme Court by President Reagan. The Democrats took everything in the kitchen sink and threw them at him. Some of their attacks and differences were warranted, but they labeled him a racist, they labeled him anti-woman, they talked about his role in Watergate, and they didn't do so with full information. It was vicious. And Robert Bork's confirmation went down in flames. And then in 1988, we saw Republicans unleash a scorched earth campaign against Michael Dukakis by using the Willie Horton ad, which basically blamed Michael Dukakis for an African-American prisoner getting out on furlough, kidnapping a man and torturing him and stabbing him multiple times and raping his fiancée.
Right.
And that was the fault of Michael Dukakis, even though George Bush and Ronald Reagan supported a massive federal furlough program.
So there's history.
Yes, there's extraordinary history. But then we have technology. And in the past 10 to 15 years, we've seen people who have been divided and who wish to say terrible things and be indecent toward one another have the gift of social media. So they can broadcast that indecency and that uncivil nature and tone to people in an instant. Now, we're seeing it happen.
As well.
And anonymously and without being anonymous. I've actually gotten death threats in several times from people both anonymous and presenting themselves as real.
And Evan, just if I could jump in there, you mentioned the degradation of public trust in elected representatives and officials and the government. And I wonder, this is something I noticed when I was working on political campaigns in the UK, and I wonder if it applies to the US as well, is that sometimes the appeal of that brash or even rude rhetoric, which is certainly not civil, is because sometimes the electorate begins to equate civility, decorum, very politically correct language with obfuscation and trying to avoid answering the questions and getting things done. So I feel like something which in President Trump's rhetoric, which appeals to certain voters, is the fact that it's unvarnished, it is brash, and it seems like he's the kind of guy that just gets down to the nuts and bolts of things and gets things done. Is that one of the appeals of rhetoric which is far less civil?
Well, make no mistake, Donald Trump is not the cause. He is a symptom of what has been going on in the United States. We can go back in the past 20 to 30 years and see countless examples of horrible and uncivil conduct toward one another. In 2010, when President Obama was looking to implement Obamacare, the Republican tactic was to go out and say that we are going to be having these death panels created by Democrats that are going to do terrible things to you, and to actually make people fear for their lives and their livelihood. And then in 2017, in the repeal and replace conversation, we saw Democrats say Republicans want to kick a whole bunch of Americans, up to 30 million of them, off of their health insurance, and they're all going to die. Yeah. And we had a shooting a year ago this month of congressional Republicans who were practicing for the congressional baseball game. Steve Scalise, the House Majority Whip, was grievously wounded and thankfully survived. But the man who did that was a far-left individual who believed a lot of the rhetoric that came out from Democrats.
What about a lot of the rhetoric that's coming from this president? I mean, this is a man who has no problem talking about women in derogatory ways and opponents in the one who punches back as coarsely as he possibly can. The point being, where does it stop? How does it stop? Whose job is it to stop this and stop the bitterness and divisiveness, because this could fracture the country?
And also isolate moderates as well, because it becomes a very extreme discourse.
I want to be clear first that it's a plague on both our houses. Both Republicans and Democrats are responsible for this. President Trump's language is absolutely abhorrent, and same with all the Republicans who say that people who are pro-choice support infanticide. And at the same time, Democrats who say that the Republicans want to kill the sick or hate the poor and minorities, that doesn't help the conversation either. And it turns off moderates. We have almost roughly a 50% turnout in every federal every federal presidential election. Yeah. And that's on a good election. And that's because people in the middle feel like they can't trust either side, and it's two sides of the same coin, just throwing vitriol and getting nothing done. And we get more and more extreme figures on the left and the right who come out, like Maxine Waters, and then members of the Tea Party like Jim Jordan, who will say, burn it all down, we won't compromise. Yeah. When was the last time Congress tackled together a major bill and was able to pass it in a bipartisan fashion? They haven't. Yeah. And that is how America isn't working. How do we fix it? Well, it's really up to us as the voters to fix it. We're the ones who are either sitting out consciously because we don't think our votes will make a difference, and we are also the ones who are going out and voting and getting to choose from the lesser of two evils. Right. The majority of the country can stand up and use the most renewable energy source on the planet, which is anger, to say it's time to be decent and return to making America work.
The problem, of course, is the system is so bitter and divisive that you're not going to get moderates to run because they don't want to put their head above the parapet. I wish we had more time, Evan. We do not. Evan, Siegfried, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.